Hi, my name is Steve Terrett. I'm an Associate Dean and Professor here at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and we're thrilled to be able to talk today with Matt Richtel. Matt is a journalist working for the New York Times. He's also the author of books. One of his books, Hooked, has been out for a couple of years now, but next May, a new book of his entitled The Devil's Plaything will be coming out. We're talking with Matt today about a series of articles that he wrote for the New York Times on distracted driving. In fact, it's a series of articles for which Matt won the Pulitzer Prize. So, Matt, I wonder if you could give us just a very short overview of the findings of the article, the main findings of the article for those who may not have been able to read the series of articles.
Right. In very brief, lots of people behind the wheel, multitasking, talking, texting, sometimes surfing the internet. A growing body of research that suggests this can greatly enhance the risk of crash, and a struggle at the highest levels of policy to figure out how to address this, and a struggle internally among drivers to figure out how to resist the temptation. They sense viscerally it's dangerous without even knowing the evidence. And even when they do know the evidence, they say, it's the other guy's problem, not mine.
I would suspect that you must have heard from a lot of policymakers who are trying to figure out just what kind of policy do you formulate to address the risks that you've written about. Can you tell us anything about how that process has gone and how you respond to policymakers?
You know, one way to underscore it is what happened in California, and forgive me, I don't have notes in front of me, but the dates were something like from 2001 to 2005, the state struggled like crazy to figure out whether to pass a ban on handheld cell phones behind the wheel, requiring, if you will, hands-free devices. And they were up against a fierce lobbying effort from the cell phone companies. Ultimately, the state did pass a hands-free requirement behind the wheel. It's been one of the few that has done such a thing. One of the reasons why the issue is so potent is that there are lots of researchers out there who say hands-free does not solve the problem, because where you really run into a challenge behind the wheel is merely being distracted by the conversation, not the phone in the hand. So that's one place where policymakers are quite divided. Should they have a hands-free ban? Should they ban the cell phone altogether? What seems to be much more a topic of agreement is whether to ban texting behind the wheel.
I think you've talked in the past some, Matt, about the difference between talking on a cell phone and talking to someone who might be the passenger sitting beside you. So you said that hands-free may not solve the problem, but is there a difference between talking on a hands-free cell phone and talking to another occupant of the car?
Sometimes I'm asked this as a gotcha question, which is, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants journalist, well, what if I'm talking to someone in the car next to me? Well, it turns out, as I was fascinated to learn early in the reporting, that research indicates when you are in the car driving and you've got a passenger next to you, that passenger actually enhances your safety.
How's that?
Because he or she acts as a second set of eyes on the road. And not only that, he or she tends to modulate the conversation based on the traffic conditions. So if it's icy, in-car cameras will show that the passenger talks less or talks more quietly or says, hey driver, look at the road. By contrast, if you're on the cell phone with somebody, the person on the other end of the line can't possibly see the road in front of you, and so that same circumstance doesn't apply.
It's very interesting. You've written both in the Pulitzer Prize winning series but also in other articles about the addictive nature of the use of electronic devices or screens that we seem to have in front of us all the time. If it truly is addictive, then do you think that laws saying that people should not be texting or talking on a cell phone with the cell phone in their hand is actually going to work? Can we expect a law to be effective in controlling an addictive behavior?
There's a fellow that I interviewed a bunch whose son was 16 when he died in a car wreck in, I think it was Martin Luther King Day, and forgive me again, I don't have my notes, the year 2003 or 4. He was driving in Michigan with his mother, and coming across the other direction was a young woman on a cell phone, and she ran into the mother and her son, and the son died. The father is a guy who later has become a big advocate in the cell phone texting, driving conversation, if you will. And he, at the time, is a really heavy cell phone user in the car by his own admission. He commuted maybe 2 hours a day going back and forth. He's devastated by this crash, and yet he finds himself in his car unable to stop answering his phone. And he says, what's going on with me? I am hyper aware of the dangers. I've looked at the research. I know the risks I'm undertaking for myself and others, and I know I've lost my son in a way that obviously devastated him. Why can't I put my device down? And what he wound up doing, what he's advocated that others do, is he started locking his phone in his trunk on the grounds that if he heard the ring, he couldn't ignore it. Now, you asked the question about the addictive nature. Let me address that. May I address that, and then I'll come to the policy implications of it. So there's some fascinating research on both the physiological side and the psychological side regarding the addictive nature of these devices, or put another way, why we find them so compulsive. And on the physiological side, there is research that suggests you get a kind of dopamine squirt when your phone rings or when you get a text. That's a neurochemical that activates your pleasure centers. I think we've all experienced this. I know I have. I'm sitting there and I hear a ping and I go, oh, that could be really interesting. Does that sound familiar?
Sure.
So the other component of that, in addition to physiological, is there's a psychological component to that, which is you never know when that incoming call or email is going to be good news. It's kind of a lottery ticket syndrome. So you feel compelled to answer because you think, well, this could be the one. It's a kind of enforcement, or called intermittent reinforcement, which psychologists and psychiatrists will tell you is among the most addictive lures that we face. What does that mean for policymakers? Well, given that the research is very early on, I think they've got to try to figure out what they want to believe and what they want to endorse. And given I take the journalistic ethos pretty seriously, so I'm not going to try to presuppose what they should do. But I will say that because the research is mounting, it seems like something policymakers would want to keep in mind. There is a very powerful lure to this stuff, and merely telling people just stop it may not suffice. Now, here's other thing to keep in mind, though. When policymakers have cracked down on things like seatbelts, on drunk driving, when citizens have understood that the penalties are real and that they are enforced, it begins to change their behavior.
Sure.
And that's the hope of public policy advocates, and that's the hope of folks like Secretary of Transportation Ray LaHood, who says, we have shown in the past that dangers behind the wheel can be curbed by effective, strong enforcement.
Do you think that the manufacturers bear any responsibility for facilitating the use of devices and maybe distracting the drivers?
Well, may I be the journalist here and say it depends who you ask? Look, to be sure, cars are being loaded on with electronic gadgetry,
Yes.
and no wonder. It's a huge profit center for the car makers. After all, the shells of cars have become almost commoditized. They are much safer on the whole than they used to be. They have more horsepower than they once had. And so if you want to differentiate yourself as a car maker, what do? It's these additions that can add to the sticker price that are, that are big deals. So for sure they are. I mean, I've looked at new cars recently too, and you get the feeling when you walk in the showroom that the salesperson's looking down his or her nose at you if you don't get the screen in the car, as if to say, what sort of Luddite must you
Right.
be, sir? Now, are those impinging safety? This is one of those areas where it depends who you ask. The car makers will say, and they will cite research that says, if your hands are on the wheel and your eyes are on the road, you're not facing near the risk or any substantial enhanced risk if you're on the phone using, say, a full Bluetooth system. There is a vigorous, zealous research community who says, not true. What they say is they will cite basic neurologic research that says your brain can process only one stream of information at a time. So if currently you're thinking about the upcoming World Series and trying to think of this conversation, it's not going to work. Or more pointedly, if you're behind the wheel and you're in a conversation, most times you're going to get away from that. Sorry, in a conversation on the phone.
Yes.
Most times you're going to get away with it. But what the research suggests is if something unexpected happens, God forbid, a child runs in the road or a car swerves in front of you, because your brain is engaged in the phone conversation, hands-free or handheld, you are lacking an instant of reaction time that can make the difference between saved lives and the horrific alternative. That's the debate happening as more gadgets come inside the car. It's very vigorous, very zealous, and depending on who you ask, unresolved right now.
Well, thank you very, very much, Matt Richtel, for the actually great journalism and for honoring the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and talking with us, where here we consider you one of the heroes of public health for the work that you've done. Thank you.
From your mouth to my wife's ears.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.